an hour. Daniel Vella from IT University of Copenhagen.
All right, hello. I'm Daniel Vella. I'm currently a PhD student at the IT University of Copenhagen. All right, so as befits a discussion on game space and landscape, I'm going to be following a bit of a winding path with this discussion. So I'll start with a brief overview of the points that I will hope to be aiming towards. So the first thing I would like to say with this discussion is that games establish an embodied subject position for the player.
Just move the computer to the back.
Yeah? Is this better?
Yeah.
All right. So games establish an embodied subject position for the player from which a particular image of the game world comes into view as a meaningful place. And when we take these 2 points together, we will arrive at this conclusion. A game enacts a particular mode of being in the world. This is basically what I hope to be arguing for with this paper. And I will be doing that through a comparative case study of these two games, so Minecraft and Proteus. How many people are familiar with these two games? Most people. All right, good. Makes my work a bit easier. All right, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a story. I told you this would be a winding path. So let's say I find myself here in this untamed wilderness completely alone. So no compass, no paths to follow, not even Google Maps telling me to turn left in 500 meters or anything. So how do I get my bearings here? Well, I climb a hill and I try to figure out what's surrounding me. Standing on the summit of this hill, I have a vantage point and I can look out 360 degrees in all directions. All around, what meets my eye is only more of this. So there's nothing to guide me. And I am unfamiliar with this landscape. So as I survey the scene, I cannot make any sense of it. I can't figure out whether I should head this way or that way or stay where I am. So yeah, I feel lost here. I have no idea of what I should be doing. But to the south, and I can tell it's south because, well, the sun is setting in that direction, so that must be west. So this must be south, and that's as far as my orientation skills take me. This is the direction I came from. So I walked down that hill. I saw some little animals running around in the grass. I tried to catch them, but yeah, that didn't quite work. I'm a city person. But then to the north, across the valley floor, I see that. So I see a path that can take me over to the other side of this ridge. I figure that maybe that will give me a view down to the next valley. Maybe there might be something interesting that I can see there. Now I have a purpose. I have some kind of orientation, even if only for a while. I know where I've been that way. I know where I'm going. I'm going to this path. This newfound orientation gives me the capacity to act meaningfully in this landscape. And it gives me some confidence as I set off on my journey. All right, end of story. I get to my point. You wouldn't have any problem taking this brief account as something which happened to me in an actual landscape. But what if I said that I was talking about an experience that I had in Minecraft or in Proteus? Now, I'm sure it probably doesn't really take much effort to reframe your understanding of this story as referring not to my experience in an actual landscape, but in one of these virtual landscapes. You wouldn't really have to change too much. There seems to be a remarkable congruence between our experience of actual and of virtual environments. Though there are, of course, some important differences, we do seem to make sense of and relate to both in similar ways. Of course, this is why we are not only able to speak of game space in the first place, but to consider it as being one of the defining features of the medium. It's why we have this whole conference about space in games. And it's why we can have statements such as the one that John quoted in his introduction this morning, that computer games are essentially concerned with spatial representation and negotiation. Or another quote, right, space is the one category that has come to be accepted as the central issue of game studies. But of course, we need to ask ourselves, what is space? In the sense that we are talking about it here. What can space tell us about games? Or what can games tell us about space? So, yeah, if you forgive me, I'm going to play the definitions game for a moment. Space is a vague concept if we just use the word space. What do we mean by it for this particular usage? So, I went to this book, right? Forgive me, I have a background in literature, I like words. So, the first definition I found here was this. Now, this is a good definition of what we could call pure space, but this is rarely what we're talking about when we're talking about space in games. The next two definitions that I found here were these two. And these are a little better because now we're not talking about space purely as an abstract quality, but here we can start talking about objects in space, of spatial arrangements between objects, and of movement in and through space. So this suggests that maybe we should start moving away from thinking about the idea of space as a general abstract concept and think instead about a space. Which leads us to the last definition I got from this dictionary, which was an area or extent delimited in some way. Now, as a side note, it's interesting how closely this echoes an idea expressed in another book, this one. But I don't want to open that can of worms here. I don't want to take up my whole 20 minutes doing that. But what I do wish to take from this understanding of space is that since we are moving from an abstract general understanding of space and towards a specific understanding of a space, then perhaps we might suggest that games are not a medium of space, but a medium of place. So obviously the distinction between space and place and the movement from one to the other has been discussed in great detail in phenomenology, and we've already heard a lot about that earlier today. Yi-Fu Tuan wrote that all people undertake to change amorphous space into articulated geography. His suggestion is that when we find ourselves in an unfamiliar landscape, as I did in that story, we are literally out of place. And because we are out of place, we are alienated from our surroundings and unable to act meaningfully. And so we go about inhabiting this space, testing out its possibilities until, again, to quote Tuan, what begins as undifferentiated space ends as a single object situation or place. When space feels thoroughly familiar to us, it has become place. In a similar vein, Edward S. Casey wrote that the process of inhabiting a landscape is that of transmuting an initially aimless and endless space into a place of concerted action, thereby constituting a dense placescape. The key point here is that space becomes a defined place when we can map actions onto it, when it becomes a locus in which and towards which we can act meaningfully. So the movement from space to place is literally a movement, a process of exploration and experimentation with the topography and the possibilities that a given space affords us. Casey again, places are something we experience, where experience stays true to its etymological origin of trying out, making a trial out of. So the process of establishing place is not one of detached contemplation, but of active participation in the possibilities that that space offers. As a result of this process is inherently embodied. It is impossible to think of being in place without thinking of embodiment within it. And it was in this regard that Casey wrote that place is what takes place between the body and landscape. So there's a bidirectional interaction here. So that to be somewhere is to be in place, and therefore to be subject to its power, to be part of its action, and acting on its scene. So there's this double-sidedness here. Right? Our embodied being determines place, but place is also determined by our embodied being. place determines our embodied being. The result of this is that when we're talking about the nature of our own being, the how and the who are intimately tied to the where, again, as Casey says. Well, these discussions on embodied being are ultimately following a path that was originally laid out by Heidegger. So for Heidegger, the basic quality of Dasein, or being there, is that it is inextricably bound in relations towards the entities along which it exists. Dasein, Heidegger says, is always already in the world. So its interactions with other entities are always defined by this sense of existing in a particular location, in a world. So it is inherent in the idea of Dasein that in the moment in which it encounters space, it makes a coherent image out of it. It represents it as a place. So the question now is, how does this relate to our experience of place in games? So at the beginning of this talk, I made the point that we talk about our experiences of real places and virtual places in very similar terms, suggesting that there is some level of similarity there. However, if we're arguing that our sense of place depends on our embodiment within it, then if we want to account for our experience of games as places, then we need to argue for a mechanism by which we can achieve some kind of virtual embodiment within that space. Rune wrote that one of the reasons why avatar-based games appeal to us is precisely because the principle of the avatar is grounded in and plays with the general phenomenology of the body. Now, there are two terms I would like to suggest that we can use to theorize this, and these have been used. So the first one is Gordon Kalea's concept of incorporation. The interesting thing here is that there is a double movement, which I would argue is very similar to the one that Casey suggests exists between place and our embodied being within it. So the process by which the game world becomes available to the player as an object of consciousness is the same process by which the player is embodied within the game world. And the second term that I will be drawing upon is the term proposed by Mary Law Ryan, which is recentering. So the relocation of consciousness to an internal position in a textual world, in this case a game world. So the next step is to try to sketch out how this can work. What are the mechanics of this recentering that achieves the player's incorporation in a virtual place? So, in a paper I presented at FDG earlier this year, I argue that the embodied subject position that a game establishes for the player can be understood as a frame through which the player forms a particular image of the game world. I obviously don't have time to go into that in detail, but in this paper I suggested that the parameters that determine this frame can be understood as the following. So first, the affordances available to the player. Here I'm drawing on the embodied phenomenology proposed by Merleau-Ponty, who says that consciousness is not a matter of I think that, but of I can. What you can do determines how you perceive the world. And of course, there's a whole tradition of people who have discussed games in terms of affordances. Chris Crawford, James Newman, and of course, Rune as well. And the second parameter, which I would argue defines this frame through which the player perceives the world, is the goals towards which these affordances are directed. Again, here I'm drawing on Merleau-Ponty, who suggested that objects in the world appear for a subject in virtue of its being polarized by its tasks, of its existence towards its tasks. And this, I will argue in this paper, can be linked also to quest theory in games, as proposed by Ryan and by Espen Arseth. Now, why did I choose Minecraft and Proteus to illustrate these arguments? I didn't choose them at random, but the first reason why I chose these two games is that they both start off from a similar premise. In both cases, the player finds herself in an open, natural landscape, with no initial indication of what to do or where to go. In doing this, they refer to the trope of the wanderer in the wilderness, which is one of the most culturally enduring images regarding the relation between the individual and the landscape. The interesting thing about this cultural trope is that in its different representations of how this lone individual deals with the wilderness, we can read divergent assumptions regarding the individual's engagement with space, place, and nature. Whether we're looking at, Robinson Crusoe, or to give it its full original title, that, which I'm not going to read. But talk about spoilers. Do you even need to read the book after that? So it even gives away the ending. So it's here, this was written in the Enlightenment, obviously, so when he's shipwrecked, Crusoe wastes no time in exerting his rational mastery over the island, in effect turning it into his own little colony. And then in another age of exploration, 2.5 centuries later, Robinson Crusoe becomes Robinson Crusoe on Mars. That's 1964. Again, reflecting culturally dominant notions of the frontier and the wilderness in which it was produced. So the question to be answered in this case study is, what do Minecraft and Proteus do with this trope? What relation do they construct between the individual and their untamed landscapes? So as I said, Minecraft and Proteus go in extremely different directions in terms of how they understand the individual in the landscape. But I'll start off with what is shared between the two. So both represent an ideal, unspoiled landscape that cannot be identified with any specific wilderness. Both employ an open landscape topography, which, as Kalleya writes, represents the spatial structure which affords players the most freedom for navigation, and therefore necessitating exploration and the working out of the player's own path through this wilderness. They also depict this landscape through a vagrant perspective, to draw on a term which had been suggested by Verdam and Arthur. So here, from this perspective, the player does not have total knowledge of the world. And so this is a perspective which, as Stefan wrote, requires the player to wander through the game space in order to make sense of it. Now, more specifically, this is a particular kind of vagrant perspective. This is a first-person subjective perspective. And as Alexander Galloway wrote, this perspective is primarily about motion through space. Now, of course, this is a perspective which we usually associate with a different kind of game, maybe something like this. Now, with reference to the first-person shooter, Galloway notes that two elements alone, a subjective camera perspective coupled with a weapon in the foreground, constitute the kernel of the image in the FPS genre. Now, Minecraft and Proteus adhere to the first of those two elements, but move away from the expectation of the second. Now, the absence of the weapon is far more than a simple visual difference. Right? I have argued that it is the affordances of the game that it gives the player that determine how the game world is imaged as a place. Now, in the FPS, the weapon represents this affordance. Its absence in Minecraft and Proteus signals the fact that they aim to enact a very different mode of being in the world. So the next step is to take a quick look at these two games individually and examine what mode of being in the world they establish for the player. I'll do this quite quickly and not in as much detail as in the paper. But we'll start with Minecraft, and by way of an introduction to that, we need to get back to Heidegger. So in the essay, The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger tried to define the essence of the technological. He argued that technology, understood essentially, was what he called techne, which he defines as a bringing forth. So the essence of technology lies in its revealing, in its capacity to bring forms into unconcealment. But Heidegger saw something different at work in contemporary industrialized technology. So this essence of industrial technology he defined as Gestell, or enframing. Industrial technology enframes human beings into a particular relation to the world, so that the world is brought forth in a particular way. So what is the nature of this enframing? According to Heidegger, the specific relation between the humanity and the landscape that is the result of this enframing is expressed in this passage. So a tract of land is challenged in the hauling out of coal and ore. The earth now reveals itself as a coal mining district, the soil as a mineral deposit. So earth is brought forth as a place in a particular way. Heidegger defines this enframing as standing reserve. The result of this enframing is that we no longer see things in the world as things, but as sources of raw material that can be stockpiled in order to be put towards some use. Now, I'm sure anyone who's played Minecraft will not require much convincing that this is how you come to see the world in Minecraft. But how does the game frame the player in this particular relation to its world? Part of the answer lies in what I will tentatively call a double ontology in Minecraft's world. So take this object in the world of Minecraft. Right, what is this? I mean, it's a tree. Compared to this object in Oblivion, the face value answer would be to say that they are both examples of the category of objects we call trees. And they might have certain functions within the game world. They might be a landmark or an obstacle, or just maybe you happen to like trees, so you like looking at them. On one ontological level, these two objects are the same. But this is where the double ontology of Minecraft comes in. On the first ontological level, the world of Minecraft is a landscape composed of objects we recognize in a landscape, such as a tree. But on the second ontological level, the world of Minecraft can be understood as an arrangement of resource blocks, like a set of Lego. So on the second ontological level, this is not a tree, but a set of these things. And this is the direction in which the player's affordances in Minecraft point. What the game lets you do is basically turn this into this. And so that is how the landscape comes to appear, as resources standing reserve. So the question that leaves us with is, standing reserve for what? So I spoke of affordances and goals as being the factors that determine the frame through which the game world is imaged. So what is the goal towards which we're going to put these resources? The obvious answer is building. And that's a replica of the IT University of Copenhagen, which was built by master students in the game group. But this only postpones the question, why do we build in Minecraft? It's not for survival, because I mean, if you just build a little tiny room and you hide in that at night, that's enough to survive. You don't need to build anything bigger, but people always do. So maybe we can find an answer by returning to Heidegger. Sorry, but yeah. So Heidegger gives a lot of importance to the question of building. He links it to the idea of dwelling. He argues that the goal of all building is dwelling. So maybe we can follow him, and we can say that the goal of Minecraft is to achieve dwelling. What Heidegger means by dwelling is not just houses, but the built environment as a whole. He writes that the relationship between man and space is none other than dwelling. So, by this definition, building enshrines a particular relation on the world. So if we are to identify a mode of being in the world that Minecraft establishes, arguably it's this. Minecraft gives the players the affordances to reshape its world, and in doing so frames it as standing reserve towards the task of the players building her own dwelling that makes sense of the landscape as a meaningful place. What about Proteus? And I'll just do this very quickly. Now, to understand the player's mode of being in the landscape in Proteus, we should start at the beginning. When you start up a new game of Proteus, you start here in the middle of the ocean. In one direction, you see an island. Now, you have no idea of who you are or where you should be going or what you should be doing, but it seems like the island is the place to go rather than swimming out into the ocean. So you swim to shore, and when you get there, you find a line of standing rocks, so you might decide to follow them. And then maybe you see a tower in the distance, and that catches your attention, and you go there, and so on. So this is definitely a space which encourages movement and exploration. It seems the game is inviting you to explore and understand this space. And at first glance, this might possibly seem like a richer environment than the one in Minecraft. There are all kinds of things for the player to discover. You might come across what appears to be a graveyard, or a herd of crabs on the beach. Is herd the right word? I don't know what the group word is for crabs. But anyway, so Proteus' landscape is full of what Michael Nietzsche could term evocative narrative elements. He uses this term to refer to elements that do not necessarily have a function within the game system, but guide the player's understanding of the place that she is in. So Proteus has a lot of these elements, even if they are intentionally vague. Are these crabs? Was that a graveyard? That's just my interpretation. But then, what affordances is the player given in relation to the game world? And the answer seems to be nothing. So the player is driven by instinct to try and interact with the world. If you see this little hut, you're going to try to get inside. If you see that little owl, which you can barely see at night, you're going to follow it around and try to catch it. But again and again, you'll just be frustrated. You find that there is actually nothing you can do in this space, except from walk around, explore, and take in your surroundings. Now, to use Heidegger's terminology one last time, I promise, this makes the landscape in Proteus present at hand rather than ready to hand, as it is in Minecraft. And this means the player is put in a receptive position to it. Of course, for Heidegger, this was a secondary mode of being in relation to the world. And some people have criticized Proteus for this lack of agency, or whatever you want to call it. But we only need to find an alternative frame of reference within which to discuss this mode of relation to the landscape. And I would argue that we can find that in Romanticism. Now, in the Romantic tradition, it is precisely through disinterested aesthetic contemplation that the individual mind can encounter the natural world. The post-Kantian Romantic subject, as M.H. Abrams note, is defined by an absolute and unsalvageable division between subject and object, mind and alienated nature. The individual finds themselves disconnected from the natural world. But according to the Romantic perspective, there is a possibility of at least glimpsing a way of overcoming this. And that's through visualizing this prelapsarian state of grace that can be achieved simply by a union of man's mind with nature. Now, an expression of this can be found in these lines of poetry by William Wordsworth. The idea here is that a creation can result from the union of the individual mind and the external world. This is the core of the Romantic idea of the imagination, which was defined by Coleridge as the living power and prime agent of all human perception. So the way in which the mind grasping the world results in the representation of that world as an image, or the creation of that image. In this light, Proteus' privileging of perception makes total sense, and it is interesting to note how far Proteus plays with perceptions, and how its external world is reflected in the player's consciousness. It's full of little tricks of perception, like this one. So for anyone who hasn't played it, there's a circle of statues on a hilltop, and if you stand in the middle of this circle at night, you get this strange kind of psychedelic effect happening with the stars in the sky. And this is not one example, there are many other similar cases. And this is not to mention the main mechanism by which Proteus explores perceptions, and this is not something I can show in a screenshot. Proteus gains a synesthetic dimension through its use of a dynamic soundtrack, which links sounds and musical elements to particular objects in the world. So that the player walks past a particular tree or structure and hears a particular musical cue associated with that object. It's tempting to read this as an expression of the subjective perception of the world of Proteus. And just to cement this link between Proteus and Romanticism, Now, this is probably no more than a happy coincidence, but I wanted to include this other poem by Wordsworth with a line which I have highlighted. Right? The way in which this reflects the opening of Proteus is probably coincidence, but I like the coincidence. All right. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I just bring back this slide, which I started off with, and I just add this little thing at the end. So through these two case studies, what I hope to have shown is that in their very different ways, Minecraft and Proteus both enact a particular mode of being in the world. That they do this through the form of their ludic structure, by putting the player in a particular relation to their game world, and therefore determining how the player can exist in that game world. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We have time for 2 questions.
No, just very briefly, I found that fascinating. Those are 2 perfect examples, actually, of this this notion that Janet Murray's talking about, this idea of agency, facilitating agency for players, because there essentially you're in both those games you're facilitating 2 different types of agency. Now, one is this kind of appreciative agency that you kind of observe things, and in the Proteus case, where it's kind of a classical aesthetic experience, whereas Minecraft is more a doing thing. It's where you're using your embodied agency in this kind of very doingful way. And it's actually quite interesting to discover. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but on YouTube there are enormous amount of mechanica. No, what do you call it?
Machinima?
Machinima.
Yeah.
Machinima made precisely in Minecraft. And I think it's because since it is made to facilitate this building kind of agency, it's a perfect place to do machinima, because it leaves quite a lot of, I mean, it's not particularly realistic or anything, but it seems to be, if you look at some of those videos on YouTube, it looks like the people are having a lot of fun. You know, they're commenting on their games, they're doing kind of meta comments and things, they're building, they're doing things, and they're fighting and they're running around and everything. So there were very, very interesting examples. And apart from that, your analysis with the Heideggerian point of view was very well done as well. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that bit about the agency in relation to this kind of being in the world and ready at hand. I think that Heidegger's being being in the world is very closely linked to the idea of agency. I don't know if you'd agree about that with what we talk about today as agents.
I think it's definitely the case that the way in which, and again, drawing on Merleau-Ponty, the way in which you are in the world depends on what you can do. Exactly. It's a matter of I can. Yeah. And that's how the world comes to appear to me. And with the example of Minecraft, as you're saying, right, of course it's going to give rise to all these massive creative projects, because that's how it pushes you through your affordances to see the landscape. Not as what it is, but as what you can make it into. So that makes it really fertile ground for all kinds of building projects. Yeah.
Okay, one more question, and then we go out to the... Were there anyone else? You want to ask a question?
Yes. Just if there was... I agree with Patrick. That was very convincing. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, when you're talking about these actually 2 modes of bringing forth the world, or something as a world, space as world, which in some way resembles a quantifiable space in Minecraft and the place in Proteus. So could you think of any other modalities or categories of bringing forth of space as something in between these 2? So another encounter with landscape, or would you say this are the 2 ways as it can be, and there's all other game experiences will fall in one or the other category?
That's a good question. I think Minecraft and Proteus are, and possibly a bit of a self-criticism, but like perfect examples of 2 really paradigmatic modes of looking at the landscape. And it's difficult to find other specific games which so directly construct a particular mode of being in the world, but every game to some extent will present a particular mode of being in the world. Even if you look at a game which is not so directly focused on the landscape itself. If you're playing, I don't know, any kind of first-person shooter or something, right? Then that's going to have a particular topographical construction which will invite you to relate to it in the way in which your affordances and your goals determine it. So, I mean, a stupid example, but if you're playing a cover-based shooter, then a particular kind of topography will be interpreted as cover, as something to be put towards that use. And again, this is determined by what you can do. So the game obviously needs some kind of a cover mechanic, and by your goals. So the need to defend yourself in that case. I'm not sure that would probably represent not quite a standing reserve, but a different kind of placement, I think, which is again determined by what you need to be doing in that space, and also by what possibilities the space offers you. But I don't think these are the only two modalities. I think that would be present. To some degree, there are as many modalities as there are games, or genres at any rate. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Applause, please.
Thank you.
And